Story 1: The night my sleep paralysis became real. I've always heard about sleep paralysis, how terrifying it can be. But I never really took it seriously until one night, something happened that I still can't explain. Even now, months later, I feel uneasy just thinking about it. This wasn't the typical can't move, see shadows experience people talk about online. What I encountered felt way too real to brush off. This started a few months ago when I was living alone in my small apartment. I was working late, exhausted from balancing my job and night classes. I'd get home around midnight, barely eat, and crash straight into bed. My sleep schedule was a mess, and I think that's when things took a weird turn. One night, after a long shift, I got into bed as usual and drifted off. The first few hours were peaceful, but somewhere around 3 a.m., I woke up, unable to move. At first, I brushed it off as sleep paralysis. I'd read about it before, so I knew the drill: stay calm, it'll pass. But this time was different. As I lay there frozen, I could feel a thick heaviness in the room. It was as if the air itself was pressing down on me. I could hear something, a faint, raspy breathing. I convinced myself it was my imagination, but the sound grew louder, coming closer. I tried to close my eyes and ignore it, but I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, and that's when I saw it. A dark figure stood there, hunched over like it was trying to hide. It wasn't just a shadow, it had a shape, with broad shoulders and a hunched back. My mind raced, telling me it's just sleep paralysis, that this thing wasn't real. But it didn't feel like a hallucination. It felt like it was really there. The figure slowly began to move closer. I could hear its feet dragging across the floor, the breathing growing even louder. Panic set in, but I couldn't scream, couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as it reached the foot of my bed. Its presence was suffocating, and it felt like it was watching me, deciding what to do next. The most chilling part? It bent down, inches from my face, and I could see its eyes. They were empty, pitch black, like bottomless pits. It whispered something I couldn't fully make out, but it sounded like it was mocking me. The voice was guttural and human, like it was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I must have been holding my breath, because suddenly I gasped for air and snapped out of it. The room was dead silent. The figure was gone. I was drenched in sweat, heart racing, and I lay there for what felt like hours before I could finally move. I was terrified to go back to sleep, convinced that if I did, it would return. The next day, I tried to brush it off as sleep paralysis, but deep down, it didn't feel like that. I've had sleep paralysis before, this was different. The heaviness in the room, the way that thing moved and spoke, it felt too real. I tried talking to a friend about it, but they just laughed it off, saying I was overtired and stressed. Maybe they were right, but part of me knows what I saw. Since that night, I've been paranoid. I leave a light on when I sleep now, and I haven't had another experience like that, thankfully. But every time I feel a chill in the room or wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, I can't help but wonder if it's waiting for me, just out of sight, biding its time. Whatever that was, whether it was just my mind playing tricks or something from another world, I never want to experience it again. The scariest part is knowing that even if it was all in my head, our minds can create horrors that are just as real as anything lurking in the dark. Story 2: The stranger in my backyard. I've never really believed in ghosts or the paranormal. To me, everything has a logical explanation. But after what happened last summer, I've started questioning everything. It was a hot night in July, and I was up late, scrolling through my phone in bed. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, so nothing much ever happens around here. My bedroom window faces the backyard, which is usually pitch black at night. I don't know why, but something made me look up from my phone and glance outside. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing near the edge of my backyard, just beyond the glow of the porch light. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at my house. My first thought was that it was a neighbor or someone who got lost. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something was off. He wasn't moving, wasn't swaying or shifting like you'd expect someone to do if they were just standing around. He was completely still. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to get up and check the locks, but something told me not to move. It was like my instincts were screaming at me to stay put. As I watched him, I noticed that he seemed blurry, almost like he wasn't fully there. It's hard to explain, but he didn't look solid. Then, without warning, he took a step closer to the house. My heart jumped into my throat. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me. I don't know how, but I just knew he was looking right at me. Slowly, he moved closer, one step at a time, until he was standing directly under the porch light. And that's when I realized he wasn't human. His face was distorted, like someone had taken a photo and smeared it with their hand. His eyes were too big, too round, and his mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity before he suddenly jerked his head to the side, as if he'd heard something behind him. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. He didn't walk away, he just vanished, like a light being switched off. I sat there, frozen in my bed, staring at the empty yard. I must have sat there for hours, too scared to move. The next morning, I checked the yard, hoping to find some sign that it was just a bad dream, a footprint, something, but there was nothing. I haven't seen him since, but every now and then, I wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone's watching me. I don't look out the window anymore. Story 3: The Whispering Voices in the Attic. Growing up, my family lived in a house that was over 100 years old. It had creaky floors, drafty windows, and an attic that I always hated. Something about that place felt wrong, like it didn't belong in our house. My parents used it for storage, and I did my best to avoid it, but that wasn't always possible. One night, when I was about 15, I was home alone. My parents were out for dinner, and I was up in my room doing homework. Everything was fine until I heard it, a soft whispering sound coming from above me. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a bird trapped in the attic. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't an animal. It was voices, multiple voices, whispering in low tones like they were having a conversation. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. It felt like they were trying to get my attention. I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed a flashlight and went to the attic door. My heart was pounding, but I had to know what was making that noise. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. When I opened the attic door, the whispering stopped immediately. The silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on me. I stood there at the bottom of the stairs, flashlight in hand, debating whether to go up. Then I heard a single voice, clear as day, say, "Come closer." That was enough for me. I slammed the door shut and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't care what was up there. I wasn't about to find out. I stayed in my room until my parents came home, and when they did, I told them what happened. They just laughed it off, saying it was probably my imagination or the house settling. But I know what I heard. After that night, I refused to go near the attic. I could still hear the whispers sometimes, but I ignored them. We moved out of that house years ago, but I still think about those voices. Whatever was in that attic wasn't human, and it was trying to lure me up there. I'm just glad I didn't listen. Story 4: The Mirror in My Grandmother's House. My grandmother passed away a few years ago, and we inherited her old house. It was a beautiful place, filled with antique furniture and vintage decor. One of the things I always found fascinating, but also kind of creepy, was a large, ornate mirror that hung in the hallway. My grandmother used to say it was a family heirloom, passed down for generations. She told me to never look into it for too long, but she never said why. After she passed, my family decided to keep the mirror. We left it in the same spot, even though it gave me the creeps. There was something unsettling about it, like it was hiding something. I tried to avoid it whenever I could, but one night I made the mistake of staring into it. It was late, and I was heading to bed when I caught my reflection in the mirror. I stopped, just for a moment, to fix my hair. As I did, I noticed something off. My reflection wasn't moving the way I was. It was subtle at first, like a delay, but then it started to smile. I wasn't smiling. I froze, watching as my reflection's grin grew wider, almost like it was mocking me. I took a step back, and that's when I saw it. Behind me, in the mirror, was a shadowy figure. It was standing in the hallway, just outside the frame, barely visible. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone, but the eerie smile was still on my reflection's face. I ran to my room and didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told my mom about it, but she just shrugged it off. "It's just an old mirror," she said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with it. I started avoiding the hallway altogether. I'd take the long way around the house just to avoid passing by that mirror. My parents thought I was being ridiculous, but I knew what I saw. Eventually, they decided to move the mirror to the attic because I kept complaining about it. We never talked about it again, but to this day, I still get chills thinking about that smile and the shadow. I don't know what was in that mirror or why my grandmother warned me about it, but I'm glad it's locked away where it can't watch me anymore. Story 5: The Haunted Road Trip. A couple of years ago, my friends and I decided to go on a road trip during the summer. We were heading to a small town a few hours away to check out some local hiking trails and camp for the weekend. We were all in high spirits, blasting music and joking around as we drove. That is, until we took a wrong turn. We ended up on a narrow, winding road that wasn't on our GPS. It was surrounded by dense woods on both sides, and there were no signs or other cars in sight. We figured we'd just keep driving until we found our way back to the main road, but the longer we drove, the more uneasy we all felt. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the trees were so thick that it felt like they were closing in on us. After about 20 minutes, we started to notice things weren't right. The road, which was paved at first, began to crumble into gravel and dirt. The trees looked twisted, almost like they were leaning toward us. Then, out of nowhere, we saw an old, rusted sign that said "Welcome to Hollow Creek." None of us had ever heard of the place, and it wasn't on any map we checked later. As we drove into what was supposedly the town, it felt deserted. There were a few rundown buildings, but they looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. We didn't see a single person, but the creepy part was that some of the buildings had lights on. We joked about it being a ghost town, but deep down, we were all getting scared. We decided to turn around and leave, but that's when we noticed something strange. The road we came in on was gone. We circled back a few times, but there was no way out. Panic started to set in as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town. It felt like we were being watched, like something was waiting for us to get out of the car. Eventually, we found a different road leading out of town, and we took it without looking back. After what felt